I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Harris. Mike is a graduate of the University of Mary Washington and the American Military Institute. He has worked for the National Park Service in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Fort Mott State Park in New Jersey, and for the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission at Brandywine Battlefield and the Daniel Boone Homestead. Mike is certified in secondary education. He currently teaches in the Philadelphia region. He lives in Pennsylvania with his wife, Michelle, and their son, Nathaniel. His first book, Brandywine, was awarded the American Revolution Roundtable of Richmond Book Award in 2014. He is also the author of the book about the Battle of Germantown, a future talk that we wish to have him give at some point. So please welcome our speaker this evening, Mike Harris.
All right, well, thanks for having me. So we're going to talk about Brandywine tonight, the first major action of the Philadelphia campaign. So let's get into that. First of all, I mean, this book's been out a while now. It's been out 8 years now. But in the early years of this, I always got the question, you know, why'd you write about Brandywine? Well, it had been pretty forgotten. Prior to my book, there were only 2 book-length treatments on the battle. One that was written for the bicentennial by a guy named Samuel Smith, which actually for its age and the resources that were available in the 1970s, it's actually not a bad book. It actually does a decent job telling the story of the battle. It's just really hard to find and rare. I paid well over $100 for my copy. The other book on the battle was written around the year 2000, and I'll be kind and call it a collection of folklore. It's not a very good history of the battle. And so when I worked at Brandywine, I started working there in 2005. There really wasn't a good single volume history on the battle. There weren't even really good research files at the park when I started there. And it was a mystery to me as I started digging. There's more troops engaged there than any other battle. There's about between 30 and 31,000 troops engaged at Brandywine. That's more than's engaged at the Battle of Long Island. It's bigger than Saratoga. It's bigger than Yorktown. It's also the longest single-day battle of the war. First shots are about 6 in the morning. It doesn't end till almost 6:30 at night. And it took up more space than any other battle, 10 square miles. And despite all of those details or those facets, really a lot has not been written about the battle. And that's why I started digging. Now, there's a lot to the Battle of Brandywine, and as Mike told you a little while ago, I only have 45 minutes. So I can't hope to tell you the entire story in 45 minutes. But I'm going to try to tell you as much of it as I can through this guy's eyes. This is John Sullivan. He's one of Washington's division commanders in the battle, and he plays a major part in what happens there. And so we're going to tell the story through his eyes. So he's from New Hampshire. He's a lawyer before the war. He's involved with the militia before the war. When the war starts, he becomes a brigadier general. He fights in Canada the first winter of the war. And then right before the Battle of Long Island, he's made a major general and given a division command. Now, he starts to get a bad reputation on Long Island. He gets captured there. Now, it's not his fault he got captured. In fact, he's not the only general captured that day. But it's what he does while he's a prisoner that makes Congress start to look at him kind of with an eye askew. So while he is a prisoner of war, William Howe, the British commander in North America, uses him as a pawn in the peace negotiations. What a lot of people don't know about the Revolution is William Howe, who was charged with winning the war for the British government, was also charged with negotiating a peace with the Americans. That's kind of a hard thing to do. Fight a war towards victory and also negotiate for peace. But that's what was going on. And so Howe asks Sullivan, again, while a prisoner of war, to go to Congress and tell them that he wants to talk about peace. Problem with this is timing for John Sullivan. This is August 1776. So Congress, just a month previous to this, has declared independence. They have no interest in discussing peace with the British government. And so Sullivan starts to get a bad reputation within the minds of many of the congressmen. All right, fast forward to the Philadelphia campaign, which actually starts up in northern New Jersey. And Sullivan's division is separated from the rest of the army. Now, not because of something he did wrong. Washington orders him up into the Hudson River Valley to kind of keep an eye on the river and make sure the British aren't going that way from New York City. And he's going to spend 7 weeks separated from the rest of the army. During that 7 weeks, he's going to choose to launch an attack against Staten Island. So when William Howe left northern New Jersey and took his army by ship to go down around the Delmarva Peninsula and up the Chesapeake Bay, while all that's happening, he left behind a garrison of British and Hessian troops in New York under the command of Henry Clinton. That's this guy here. And Sullivan decides it's a good idea to try to attack one of his outposts on Staten Island. I don't know if it was a good idea, but John Sullivan did it. And even though he has some initial success, Clinton rushes reinforcements over, drives Sullivan back, and the net result is Sullivan loses about 200 guys in this operation. In the grand scheme of things, this is not that big a deal, but it's viewed by Congress as another failed operation by him. It's also another case of bad timing, because about the same time Congress got news of this debacle, they got news that Fort Ticonderoga has been captured by the British. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the Philadelphia campaign is happening at the same time as the Saratoga campaign. So you have a British army moving south out of Canada along the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor. And one of the first things that British army has to do to get south is eliminate the threat that's posed by Fort Ticonderoga. Again, for those of you that aren't familiar, Fort Ticonderoga sits at the southern end of Lake Champlain. And that's what we're talking about here. So Congress wants answers. All this bad news is coming in. They actually wanted a court of inquiry. They wanted an investigation into Sullivan's conduct. But because they're in the midst of a campaign, Washington, at least temporarily, is going to be able to put that on hold. Okay, so fast forward a little bit farther. It's now early September 1777, and John Sullivan has rejoined the rest of the army in northern Delaware. And along with the rest of the army, he will cross the Delaware state line on the night of September 9th and start to deploy with the rest of the army just east of Chadds Ford along the Brandywine River, as you can see here on the map. This is basically 2 days before the battle. All right, let's talk about who Sullivan commands, because we're going to be talking about his guys quite a bit here. He has about 1,800 men, and they're broken into 2 brigades, so it's a 2-brigade division. It's mostly Maryland troops, with and then a little bit of Delaware and Canadian troops. Most of these guys are new to the Army. One of the things you got to realize is that the Army that fought in 1776 around New York and at Trenton and Princeton basically disintegrates over that winter, or actually even into late 1776. They had 1-year enlistments, and as their enlistments expired, they just left and went home. It's why Trenton and Princeton are such huge victories for the American Army, because the Army was shrinking daily from guys walking home. And so throughout the spring, summer, and I would argue through the fall of 1777, there's a massive recruitment effort going on to bring new troops and to create new regiments for the Army. And that was an ongoing process throughout the campaign. Now, yes, there are some officers and NCOs that re-enlisted from the previous year, but the vast majority of these guys had not seen combat prior to Brandywine. Who are his 2 brigade commanders? One of them is likely this guy. This is Colonel John Stone from Maryland. The guy that was supposed to be commanding this brigade, General William Smallwood, is not with the Army. When Washington arrived in Delaware, just a little bit before this, he sent Smallwood into Maryland to help raise the Maryland militia. So he's not with the Army. And if you're into these kind of details, if you're a military guy like me, these are the regiments of the brigade. So you've got the only regiment from Delaware here, and then 3 Maryland regiments and part of another Maryland regiment. The other brigade is commanded by a French officer, Prudhomme de Boré. I cannot find an image of him, so this medal is going to represent him for us. Again, if you're into these kind of details, you've got 3 Maryland regiments, something called the German Regiment, and something called Congress's own regiment. So let me explain those 2 regiments for you. The German Regiment was created by Congress by recruiting within the German communities of Pennsylvania and Maryland. The idea of this regiment was to counteract the use of German troops by the British Army. It's a little stupid because it's 1 regiment versus dozens of regiments the British get from the German principalities, collectively known as the Hessians. But that was the idea. The other odd regiment is known as Congress's own regiment. This is a regiment that was recruited from the French Catholics of Canada during the failed invasion of Canada early in the war. These were people that were for the American cause, but because they're not from one of the original 13 states, they're known as Congress's own regiment. All right, a little bit more on de Boré. Again, he's a French officer with 35 years of experience. He volunteered to come over here and help, just like Lafayette did, and Kosciuszko, and Pulaski, and all these other French officers, or foreign officers, I should say. But what's important to know is he's the senior brigade commander. So if something happens to Sullivan, Sullivan gets killed, gets wounded, is given a different command for some reason, that will leave de Boré in command of the division. Well, why is that important? He barely speaks English. Just to explain how bad this is, his report on the battle that's written to Washington is a mixture of French and broken English. Keep in mind, Washington could not read or speak French. So if this is how he's communicating with the commander-in-chief, just think about how he's communicating with all these American soldiers and citizens. So I just kind of want you to keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so here's our battlefield, or at least the vast majority of it. And I'm going to gamble here that some of you know some of the local roads. So I'm going to try to give you some modern place names here. So this road running along the bottom of the map here, this is modern day US Route 1. Some landmarks on Route 1, Chad's Ford, that's where Route 1 crosses the Brandywine today. The Brandywine River Museum, where the Wyeth art is, sits just east and south of where that bridge is today. Another landmark that you may be familiar with is the modern Battlefield Park. That 50-acre park is at a rectangle just on the north side of Route 1, where this Ring and Gilpin House are. Other landmarks you may be familiar with, Welch's Tavern no longer stands, but today that is the entrance to Longwood Gardens. So if you ever visited Longwood Gardens and you went into the entrance road, you drove right through where Welch's Tavern once was. All right, another major road many of you may be familiar with is US Route 202. That is the old Wilmington Road. Now today, 202, there's a traffic light right here, and 202 continues north to Westchester. Historically, that road cut up through the village of Dilworth, but 202 basically runs right through here today. Turk's Head Tavern is modern Westchester. So hopefully some of those landmarks help you place yourself on the battlefield. All right, so again, we're focused on Sullivan's division. The vast majority of his division, oops, let me back up, is going to be positioned where this long blue rectangle is. This is about a mile north of Chad's Ford proper. His division is responsible for watching Britain's Ford. Britain's Ford today is where, again, if you're familiar with the area a little bit, this is where Britain's Bridge Road comes out. Today, there's a road that runs parallel to the Brandywine called Creek Road. Did not exist in the 18th century. But if you drive up Creek Road today and you cross over Britain's Bridge Road, that's where this is. And Britain's Bridge Road connected the Ford to Dilworth. Okay. Now, Sullivan is also responsible for the next 3 forts to the north. So he has one regiment, Colonel David Hall's Delaware Regiment, watching Jones's Ford. That is where Street Road or Route 926 crosses the Brandywine today. And then he has Colonel Moses Hazen's regiment. These are the French Canadians known as Congress's own regiment, split. There's about 150 of them at Wister's Ford. It's where Route 52 crosses today. And the other half of them is at Buffington's Ford. There's actually no modern road crossing that one, but you can see the distances involved here on the map. Now, it's a pretty long front. He's got about a 7-mile front that he's responsible for. He also has this 2-gun artillery battery with him at Britain's Ford. So that's Sullivan's position in the morning of the battle. He's the right flank of the army. He has 2 very questionable brigade commanders under him, and he's exceptionally vulnerable to a flank attack. Now, we're talking about this through the eyes of Sullivan. We're not really looking at what the British are doing here. But just to make sure nobody's totally lost, you can see on this map here what the British plan is. The British are going to send a diversionary column straight up Route 1 to hold the Americans in place, while a 9,000-man column is going to make the 17-mile flank march to come into the right rear of the Americans, behind Sullivan's flank. That's the British plan. It wasn't a novel concept. This is the 6th time that William Howe does this to Washington. It wasn't a new tactic. Washington just never figured it out. So that's what's going on here. All right, so that gets us to the morning of the battle. So Sullivan doesn't get involved until pretty late morning. So first shots are fired 6 a.m. down here by Welch's Tavern. But ultimately, this man, Wilhelm von Kniphausen, the senior Hessian officer in North America, is going to drive back a series of American outposts along Route 1 and come up to the west side of the Brandywine here. And this is all by about between 8 and 9 o'clock is when Kniphausen starts to push into this area, and Sullivan's division starts skirmishing with those advanced elements of Kniphausen's division. And that's happening here at Britain's Ford. Now, then what's going to happen is a series of intelligence reports are going to come in the headquarters, most of which are going to pass through John Sullivan's hands before they get to Washington, because he's on the right flank. So we need to go through these things. First of them comes about 9:30 in the morning from a Major Jameson, who Sullivan writes to Washington saying, Jameson came to me at 9 o'clock and said that he had come from the right of the army, and I might depend that there was no enemy there. And before we examine what Jameson's saying, let me explain my image of Washington. People love to portray Washington at an age he never achieved. People like to portray him as this 80-year-old man leading men in the battle. It's just not true. Washington's 45 during the Philadelphia campaign. He still has red hair. He never wore a wig a day in his life. When he's older and he's president, that's his white hair pulled back. And so it's kind of a pet peeve of mine that people portray him at way too old. This is actually the wax figure of him in Mount Vernon, if you're not familiar with it. It's supposed to portray him at Valley Forge, which is not long after this. Anyway, so let's examine what getting ahead of myself. This is Charles Coatsworth Picni. He's on Washington's staff, and he confirms what Sullivan reports. Some light horse were dispatched above the forks of the Brandywine to see if they actually had their crossed, and they, when they returned, brought information that there was no appearance of the enemy in that quarter. So what these guys are all saying is they sent some dragoons up here. This is what's known as the forks of the Brandywine. See how there's an east branch and a west branch of the Brandywine? Well, that area in between that is known as the forks of the Brandywine. And they sent guys up there and they didn't find anybody. Well, yeah, that's true. At 9:30 in the morning, the British haven't gotten that far yet. By my calculations, the British have only got about this far on their flank movement by 9:30. They don't get to the west branch until 11. Keep in mind, the British are going to have to cross both branches. So they're going to have to ford the river twice. And they're not even at the first crossing. So this is probably the most accurate report that's going to come in all day long from the right flank of the army. This is 9:30 in the morning. Another half hour goes by, and Colonel Moses Hazen, he's the guy actually on the right flank, he reports to Sullivan that the British are making a flanking move. Well, who's the guy in the best position to know that? It's Moses Hazen. He's the officer on the right flank here. But Washington, hold on, before I get ahead of myself. Sullivan is starting to worry. He's starting to hear a report of another flanking movement. Now, keep in mind, Sullivan was captured on Long Island because of this exact same tactic by William Howe. And so he's starting to worry a little bit. He writes this after the battle. I had no orders or even hints to look at any other places, but those mentioned. Nor had I light troops or light horsemen furnished for the purpose. I had but 4 light horsemen, 2 of which I kept at the upper fords to bring me intelligence. The others I kept to send intelligence to headquarters. So what is he saying? He's got a 7-mile front here, and he's only got 4 guys on horseback to do any kind of scouting or relaying of messages. 2 up here, 2 down here. That ain't a lot. That ain't a lot. And keep in mind, there's about 800 cavalrymen with this army. So that begs the question, where are they at? Because if they're not with Sullivan watching the right flank, which is where they should be, or off the left flank watching the left flank, where are they? Well, they're not where they need to be. Oops. They are right here. So this number 5 block on the map here is the Dragoon Brigade. They're probably camped in the entrance of the modern park. You ever been to Brandywine Battlefield Park and you pull into the entrance? There's like a low ground there that you're driving through to get to the visitor center. There's a creek that runs through that low ground. My guess is they're camped along that creek for watering their horses. Clearly not where they need to be. So Sullivan goes on the right. It was ever my opinion that the enemy would come around on our right flank. This opinion I often gave the general. I wrote him that morning that it was clearly my opinion. So Washington decides not to listen to Hazen. I actually think this is a mistake by Washington. Hazen was a veteran officer. Hazen had been an officer in the British Army during the French and Indian War, and he was in the best position to know what was happening. Instead, Washington sends Theodore Bland, another dragoon officer, a Virginian, to go and confirm Hazen's report. This man will have to leave from down here just to get up to here to confirm this report. Now, there's a couple of issues with using Bland. Bland is a Virginian. He doesn't know the roads. He doesn't know where he's going. The other issue is he's a doctor by profession. He's not a military man. But this is the man Washington chooses to send north. All right, so about noon, a report comes direct to Washington, not through Sullivan this time, that an officer reports that they have skirmished with the flanking column. Try to get this out of the way here. This skirmish probably happened somewhere in this area here where my pointer is. And Washington says, well, I haven't heard from Bland, but Hazen must be right. Because if somebody's skirmishing with troops way out here, there must be a flanking movement happening. And so he says, that must mean I'm facing less than half the British Army at Chad's Ford. I'm going to launch an attack at Chad's Ford, try to take out this part of the British Army, and I'll worry about that other half some other date and time. And so he actually orders an attack across Chad's Ford and Britain's Ford. Around noon, this is happening. Sullivan confirms it. He says, I was ordered to cross the Brandywine with my division, and I attacked the enemy's left while the army crossed below me to attack their right. This is Timothy Pickering, the Army's adjutant general. He reports it was satisfactorily concluded that only a part of the enemy's army was on the other side of Chad's Ford, and in consequence, preparations were made for attacking. But then about 12:30, just as this is starting to escalate, skirmish fire is picking up, increased artillery fire, it's just starting to escalate when Sullivan gets another report from a militia major, Joseph Spear. And this is what he writes. I saw Major Spear of the militia, who came this morning from a tavern called Martin's in the forks of the Brandywine. He came from thence to Welch's tavern and heard nothing of the enemy. So what this guy Spear claims is that he left from Martin's Tavern, which is located here. The ruins of it still stand. It's sort of a stabilized ruin today. But he claims he rode from there to Welch's Tavern. That's where Longwood Gardens is today. And then back to Britain's Ford, where Sullivan is. And he didn't find anybody. Process that for a minute. He didn't see anybody. This flanking column is just under 9,000 troops, plus supply wagons, 2 squadrons of light dragoons. There's a lot of dust being kicked up by this along the roads. And it's not a quiet column. But he didn't see or hear anything. That's what this guy claims. Sullivan doesn't believe him, but he feels he has to tell Washington what this guy just said. He says, had the general crossed over and found the whole British army well posted in his front, and his army put to the rout, having a river unfordable in his rear, and he had afterwards found out that I had received and withheld the intelligence, which might have prevented this misfortune, and demanded my reasons, I believe I never should have been able to give one, which would have been satisfactory to him, to Congress, and to the world. This is CYA. He's covering his butt. Sullivan doesn't believe Spear, but he feels he has to tell Washington what he said. And so he does. Sullivan goes on to write, this intelligence did by no means alter my opinion upon an apprehension that General Howe would take that advantage which any good officer in this situation would have done. Of course, that's what Howe's doing. So it's now 12:30, and Washington calls off this attack. Again, it never really escalated into a full-fledged fight, but he does call it off, and they start to pull back across the river. And just as they're pulling back, Theodore Bland, our Virginian cavalry officer, is finally sending a report to Sullivan. And he reports, I have discovered a party of the enemy on the heights, just on the right of the two Widow Davises. I'll show you this on the map in a second, who live close together on the road called the Fork Road, about a half mile to the right of the meeting house. Oops. So what he's saying is he's seeing the British deploying on Osborne's Hill. The two Widow Davises lived at this intersection, and this is probably where Bland is located when he's making this report. Sullivan reports to Washington, Colonel Bland has at this moment sent me word that the enemy are in the rear of my right, about 2 miles coming down. There are, he says, about 2 brigades of them. There's actually a lot more than that. He also says he saw a dust back in the country for above an hour. So there's a reference to all the dust being kicked up by that British column. The very first intelligence I received that they were actually coming that way, I instantly communicated to Washington. And so they start rushing troops to the north. So now we've zoomed in on the map. We're a little bit north of Chad's Ford here. So here's Route 926, Street Road today. This today is the modern Birmingham Road that cuts right through the heart of the battlefield. And here's that village of Dulworth again that we saw in the previous map. Westchester is just north on this map. So 3 divisions are rushing north. Lord Stirling's, Adam Stevens, and John Sullivan's own division. Stirling and Stephen take this roundabout road to get up here. Sullivan's going to cut cross country to get up in line with the other 2. They're facing Howe and Charles Cornwallis, and you see the British deploying here. So several things are going to happen relatively quickly. The guys that were way up north watching those forwards have to sneak past the flank of this British formation to link back up with the division. Something else that happened, when Sullivan was told to ride north, he was also told that he was to take command of the entire wing, meaning all 3 of these divisions. So not only is Sullivan to command his own division, but he's also to oversee Stirling and Stephen. Another way to look at that is his senior brigade commander now assumes command of his own division while he assumes overall command of this entire formation. So that leaves our French friend that doesn't speak a lot of English in command of Sullivan's division. So now before he rides off to talk to them, he notices a problem. He says, I then found it necessary to turn off to the right to form and to get nearer to the other 2 divisions, which I that moment discovered drawn up on an eminence both in the rear and to the right of the place I was then at. What does all that mean? All right, so because he didn't follow the same roads that the other 2 divisions followed, his division ends up out of place. They actually end up all the way up here by Street Road, while the other 2 divisions are up on Birmingham Hill. And so he's up here, he literally looks over his right rear shoulder, and he says, I gotta get in line with them 2, but I also need to go talk to them. So he turns to Deborah and he says, look, get my division in line with these two, but I need to go talk to them, and he leaves. So couple things happen. These two divisions shift slightly to the right. This is not a big deal. This is not a problem. The problem's over here. So Boré, rather than just do an about face, march straight south and about face again, he doesn't do that. He puts a division in a marching column, like they're going to march down a road with a narrow front, kind of like what these guys look like, not in a battle formation. He marches them south, then east, and then he's going to try to wheel them up onto the hill into a battle formation. It's a very complicated maneuver. Keep in mind, this is before Valley Forge, before this army went through the training it really needed. And so they are literally in the middle of this maneuver when the British attack begins. And the British Brigade of Guards, led by General Edward Matthew, is going to slam Sullivan's division in the middle of that complicated maneuver. All right, so let's get a couple quotes here. This is Sir George Osborne. He's the Grenadier Commander of the Brigade of Guards. He says, "We attacked the left flank of the rebel army and raining upon the brigades of Sullivan with an impetuosity, really that it would have been scarcely possible for them to resist. We saved much loss we might otherwise have sustained and certainly made the enemy first give way." This is Colonel John Stone, one of the brigade commanders for Sullivan. He says, "I wheeled off." So he's describing trying to wheel up onto that hill. "But I had not reached the ground before we were attacked on all quarters, which prevented our forming regularly. And by wheeling to the left, it doubled our division on the brigade immediately in the rear of the other. Thus we were in confusion." So I know it's hard for you guys to see me, but if you can imagine, there's two brigades, one behind the other, and they're trying to wheel up onto that hill. Well, as they come up, that brigade in the front is going to get slammed by the British, and they are going to retreat through the other brigade, which is going to destroy both formations. I know it's hard for you guys to see that over a computer, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to describe there. That's what happens. And this is what it looked like. This is a watercolor that is painted on the inside of the back cover of Lord Cantilupe's diary. Lord Cantilupe was an officer in the Brigade of Guards. He was here, or not here, he was at Brandywine. And this is what it looks like. The original of this is about the size of a postcard. It's really small, but the detail in this is unbelievable. So you've got Birmingham Hill here at the top, Street Road running along the bottom of this image. Then if you can tell, look here, there's little tiny red brush strokes. That is the British Brigade of Guards lined up behind the fence along Street Road. Another amazing detail is here and here, there are horses moving artillery. What's even cooler about that is the men moving that artillery are little blue brush strokes, because Royal artillerymen wore blue coats, not red. Okay. And then you've got elements of Sullivan's division peeking out through the woods at the top of Birmingham Hill. Now, what's really, really fascinating about this is that this house and this house still stand. So you can pinpoint this position today. Today, this is a modern view of it. So you got Birmingham Hill at the top, here's Street Road at the bottom. What's fascinating about this is the British Army stayed on the battlefield for 5 days after the battle. My guess is sometime during that 5-day period, Cantilupe sat on this slope and painted that image into the back of his diary. Might be the earliest image of Chester County, Pennsylvania. Just really cool stuff. Okay, so let's get back to the battle here. So Sullivan's own division is just disintegrated. He rides into the mess and tries to rally his division. How am I doing? Okay. No sooner did I form one party, that which I had before formed would run off. And even at times when I, though on horseback and in front of them, apprehended no danger. I then left them to be rallied if possible by their own officers and my aides de camp. So he tries to rally them, realizes it's a waste of time, and then he rides back over here and he's going to try to hold the line with these two divisions. But it was a really, really difficult ask. My thing's blocked here by the thing here. I'm trying to read what my quote is. Oops, I didn't want to do this so I can see that. Okay. All right, let me try to remember the beginning of this line, this quote here. He says, we tried to hold the line because he knew if carried by the enemy, I knew would instantly bring on a total rout and make a retreat very difficult. I therefore determined to hold as long as possible. So basically he wants to hold this line to try to give Washington a chance to rally or at least retreat before all the roads are taken by the British Army. But it's an impossible task. Look at what they're up against here. And then it basically becomes like a line of dominoes. The British just keep turning one flank after another. So each successive regiment, brigade, is going to collapse like a line of dominoes from left to right and retreat through Dilworth. Sullivan writes, when we found the right and left oppressed by numbers and giving way on all quarters, we were obliged to abandon the hill we had so long contended for, but not till we had almost covered the ground between that and Birmingham Meeting House with the dead bodies of the enemy. That's a bit of a myth, this idea of covering the ground with the dead bodies of the enemy. William Howe issued orders in 1776 that when the Americans are about to fire a volley at you, drop to the ground and let the bullets go over your head. So in the smoke and confusion of battle, a bunch of guys purposely laying on the ground probably look like casualties to the Americans, but the vast majority of them are not. They were purposely laying on the ground. So now everybody's retreating. So where all that fighting was just north, west off the top edge of this map. So now they're all retreating across these farm fields. Washington now arrives on this part of the battlefield. Nathaniel Greene is rushing his division up to try to save the day. Henry Knox arrives with a couple artillery pieces. And it appears from the documentary evidence that Sullivan came up with a plan to hold the roads open. And I'll explain this on the map in a second, but we have this from Charles Coatsworth Picni. This is who actually writes this. He says, Sullivan proposed to the general to halt Greene's division and to display and take the enemy in flank as they came down. This General Washington acceded to, and I was directed to carry the orders. So what they're going to do is they want to form this position with Greene's fresh division and the remnants of those three divisions that fought up on Birmingham. So Sullivan has rallied some guys behind a fence line. Knox has showed up with those two artillery pieces, and they're going to do a fighting retreat back to Greene's fresh division. And it's going to look something like this. So back to a second fence line, and then ultimately they are going to reform on either side of Greene's fresh division. Now, I don't have a Sullivan quote for this, so I don't have a map that shows you this. But what happens is it's getting late in the day, the sun's setting. One battalion of British Grenadiers pushes up into this. And you can see here, this is like a U-shaped formation. And they are going to fire into the British Grenadiers from basically three sides. And so they ask for help. The 4th British Brigade comes up on their left, but they too end up in this triangulation of fire. And so this action late in the day as the sun is setting is what saves the American army and allows them to retreat that night. So that's how the battle ends. What does this mean for Sullivan? Well, 3 days later, Congress votes to recall Sullivan, pending an investigation into his actions at Staten Island and Brandywine. Our French friend, Deborah, he resigns, he leaves. He's going to go back to France. And Sullivan begins to gather testimony. Washington doesn't have time for this. He says, our situation at this time is critical and delicate. To derange the army by withdrawing so many general officers from it may and must be attended with many disagreeable, if not ruinous consequences. What's he talking about? You can't court-martial somebody where the officers of the court are of a rank lower than the officer being court-martialed. Sullivan is a 2-star general. So you have to have a board of officers or a panel of officers to conduct that court-martial that are other major generals. It would mean that every major general in the army would have to leave their jobs to go do this. And that's what Washington's talking about here. I can't do this right now. And look at this date. 2 days later is the Battle of the Clouds. 5 days later is the Battle of Pulaski. A couple weeks later is the Battle of Germantown. There's a lot going on, and Washington ain't got time to deal with this. Now, when I wrote the book, I had not found the court-martial documents. What I did find was in John Sullivan's papers, the evidence he started to gather in his defense. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples. I have an entire appendix in the book if you're really interested in all the details, but these are just a couple examples because I'm also running out of time here. Thomas Conway, he's a brigade commander in Lord Sterling's division. He writes, if part of the division was not formed completely before the engagement, the fault cannot be imputed to General Sullivan. The short time left to his troops in order to form was hardly sufficient for well-disciplined troops and well-exercised, and by no means sufficient for the troops of this army. This is William Wilcox. He's a staff officer to Lord Sterling. He says, the enemy, by good luck or perhaps policy, made their attack before the intended disposition of your division could be carried into execution. It was therefore rather to be considered as unfortunate as ill-judged, and not to be laid at the door of any particular officer. And what did Washington himself say? I ascribe the misfortune principally to the information of Major Spear, transmitted to me by you. But yet I never blamed you for conveying the intelligence. On the contrary, I should have thought you culpable in concealing it. The Major's rank, reputation, and knowledge of the country gave him a full claim to credit and attention. His intelligence was no doubt a most unfortunate circumstance, but it was not your fault that the intelligence was eventually found to be erroneous. So Washington doesn't blame him. And ultimately what happens? Now, when I wrote the book, I had not found that an actual court-martial had happened. Well, it did. When I was working on my Germantown book, I found the documents. So in late October and early November, there are 4 court-martials of generals in Washington Army. William Maxwell is court-martialed for drunkenness at Couch's Bridge and Brandywine and exonerated. I'll come back to Sullivan in a second. Anthony Wayne goes through a court-martial for his loss at the Battle of Paoli, and he's exonerated. John Sullivan will go through the same process. Now, he is exonerated. So some of this, I actually need to update this slide. He's exonerated. The evidence exonerates him. And if you end up getting a copy of my book, the appendix shows all that evidence. So he's exonerated. I actually think Congress just had it out for him. It's clear when you look at the primary documents that it's not Sullivan's fault they lost the battle. He conveyed every piece of information that came to him to Washington. If it's anybody's fault that they lost, it's Washington's fault for not being better at intelligence gathering, not choosing officers familiar with the area to scout those roads. Those are faults of Washington, not to one of his division commanders. And then if you're curious who the 4th general officer is that was court-martialed, that is Adam Stephen, who was court-martialed for drunkenness at the Battle of Germantown. And he's actually cashiered from the Army. He's one of only 2 general officers ever to be cashiered from the Army, the other one being Charles Lee after the Battle of Monmouth. So what happens to Sullivan? He will go on to lead his division at Germantown. Later in the war, he leads a pretty famous expedition against the Mohawks in upstate New York, known as Sullivan's Trail, if you're familiar with that at all. He returns to New Hampshire in 1781, helps ratify the Constitution. When Washington became president, he's appointed a federal judge, and he dies in 1795. This is his grave up in New Hampshire. So that's my story. If you got questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you are interested in a signed copy of one of my books, you're more than welcome to email me direct, and I will ship one to you. But go ahead, I'll take the questions. I think I did that right at 45 minutes, Mike. That was pretty good.
You nailed it. Hey, that's close enough for government work, right? So thank you very much there, Mike. Actually, Zoom has given me issues this evening where my Q&A is not working. So if people do have any questions, if you could run them through the chat as well.
Well, Mike, there's one here I can at least answer because my Q&A is working. So yeah, it says, will it be yeah, I don't know. There's maybe you're not a host. I don't know. Mike. So somebody asked, Howard asks if there'll be a reenactment at Brandywine this year. There will be. It is the weekend. I'm going to tell you guys the wrong date.
It's in the 20s.
I think it's the 22nd and 23rd. Does that sound right?
24, 25 is
then it's that weekend. Yeah, it must be that weekend. So, but it's held not where the park is. So it's held in Sandy Hollow Park, which is a Birmingham Township park on the northern end of the battlefield. It's about, trying to think, maybe a mile and a half north of where the park is on Route 1. is where it's off of Birmingham Road. I mean, if you Google, I'm sure you could find that. I'm scheduled to be there both days, and I'm not clear whether I'm narrating during the battle or if I'm actually giving a lecture each day. We're still working out the details on that, but I'm supposed to be there both days for that. It's supposed to be a big deal, probably be the largest reenactment in the country this year. Big deal.
And Mike, if you could just talk a little bit, that Sandy Hollow Park, that's a relatively new acquisition. That was something that hasn't.
Trying to think, that was there when I worked there.
Right,
but
it's been developed into a park.
Yeah, it's not as new as some of the other land acquisitions. So give you an idea, the state only owns 50 acres along Route 1, which unfortunately is not really where any of the fighting happens. If you noticed my talk, we didn't talk about really anything happening where the park is. So, but there's been a number of acquisitions. So that Sandy Hollow Park was probably the first acquisition in the early 2000s. And that is a pretty big chunk of ground. It's the ground that Adam Stevens' division defended against the British Light Infantry and Hessian Jaegers. Then while I was working at the park, now we're getting into like 2008-ish, a big chunk of Birmingham Hill was acquired, which is where Lord Stirling's division fought. It's where Lafayette was wounded. It's where the British Grenadiers attacked. It's also where the cover of my book is portraying that part of the battlefield. Then more recently, since my book came out, a chunk of land just west of Dilworth was acquired by the American Battlefield Trust. Another chunk of land was acquired on Osborne's Hill, where the British deployed for the battle. And then the most recent, within the last year, maybe two, a chunk of ground south of Dilworth, where that, remember when I was talking about Henry Knox showing up with two guns and they did this fighting retreat, where those two guns started, that land has now been acquired. They were going to build townhouses there, and now that land's been saved. And it's that's public. There's trails there. You can walk right up to the spot where those two guns were now. So those are big, huge victories in the last 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, so that's, to my mind, I think that's one of the great stories of Brandywine, is that there's so much more of the battlefield that is available to the public today than what there was 25 years ago.
Yeah, and there's a lot more walking trails now. You could walk to a spot where Lafayette was wounded. You can walk the whole line of Conway's brigade on Birmingham Hill, which again, none of that could have been done. Some of that even as little as 5 years ago. There's another question here asking about Kniphausen. So Kniphausen doesn't cross the river. So yes, initially he's got this feint going on, this diversion along Route 1, because the idea was they don't want Washington to ship troops to the north. So, but once Kniphausen hears the sound of fighting to the north, he starts to push across. This is about, I don't know if I had to put a time on it, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time he actually starts to push across the Brandywine, there aren't many Americans left at Chad's Ford. Sullivan, Stirling, Stevens' divisions had pulled out of there. Green's division had pulled out of there. The only people left there were Anthony Wayne's division, William Maxwell's light infantry, and the Pennsylvania militia. From all the accounts I can find, the Pennsylvania militia just ran away. They did not put up a fight at all. So it was really Wayne and Maxwell trying to stop Kniphausen's entire division, which was an impossible task. And so what they do is they did a fighting retreat, much like Greene did to the north, to hold Route 1 open for the army. So they do get pushed back. If there's any fighting where the park is today, that's the only fighting that happened there during that fighting retreat by Wayne. But just, I don't know if I had to put a number, maybe a half mile east of the park is where Wayne stopped falling back and just held the line because it got dark and he could stop. So Robert, hopefully that answers your question about Kniphausen. He doesn't exactly, Wayne doesn't exactly link up with Greene. So Kniphausen never actually fights against Greene because he's dealing with Wayne. So hopefully it answers your question, Robert.
Okay, Mike, over on the chat, we have a question here, and it was, did the American soldiers have uniforms that matched?
No. In fact, I would argue there ain't a point in the entire war where they did. But that we could argue that at the end of the war. Technically, I got other questions in the Q&A here too. I'll get to, Mike.
Okay.
Technically, every region was supposed to have uniform color. So Virginia was supposed to have blue uniforms with white facings. I think New York was gray with green facings. Don't quote me on that. I might have that wrong. New England, I think, was blue with green facings. And the mid-Atlantic colonies like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland were supposed to be blue with red facings. Now that might have been what was by regulation, but that's by no means what they were all wearing. Some of them were still wearing farming clothes. Some are wearing hunting frocks. Some are wearing old militia uniforms. So there's definitely no uniformity to the American uniforms. And again, I would argue that's probably true the entire war. That was the question, right?
Yeah, that was the question.
Okay.
And the idea that, not only did the American Army not have all uniforms across the board, even amongst regiments and other units, there wouldn't have been uniformity within those either.
And it creates confusion. I'll give you an example from Brandywine. The Pennsylvania State Regiment, which is actually part of Nathaniel Greene's division, had just recently gotten brand new uniforms. It might have been the only regiment relatively uniformly clothed, at least jacket-wise. Most of that regiment's wearing blue coats or red facings going into the fight. So when the British encounter Greene's division late in the day, they actually because it's getting dark at that point, they actually mistake that line for a line of Hessians, because there were Hessian regiments that wore blue coats with red trim. And in the darkness and the confusion, they don't fire at them thinking that they're Hessians, and then they get blasted by an American volley. So because the British were so unused to uniformity within the American ranks, it's an example there where it did help them. Yeah. All right, I got a couple questions here in the Q&A. Joe's asking Pulaski's role. Joe, you've clearly not read my book. I think the story of Pulaski is a myth. So take a deep breath. I'm going to break a myth for you. So the traditional story about Casimir Pulaski is that late in the day, he takes Washington's life guard of mounted guards, say 50 guys, and charges into the flank of the British column coming down off of Birmingham Hill. That's the traditional story that you'll find in several books. The problem is I'm reliant on primary sources. I cannot find an 18th century source that confirms that story. Nobody that was at the battle mentions it. And a cavalry charge is a pretty rare thing. Somebody would have mentioned it. There's no British sources talking about it, and there's no American sources talking about it. So then that begs the question, what's the source of the story, right? So there's an don't quote me on the date, 1820 something newspaper story that's published with the story in it. And so there's a number of secondary books out there about Brandywine that use that newspaper account as their source for the story. Well, when I went and tracked down that newspaper, which is not an easy thing to do, by the way, when I tracked down that newspaper and got a copy of the article myself, it's clear that they are talking about a different battle and not Brandywine. So the whole source of that story is just bungled source interpretation. All right, so that was one of your questions, Joe. And then you got a question here. What was the date of the meeting with Howe? Oh, good question. So William Howe meets with Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Rutledge on the Staten Island Peace Conference. I think you're right, Joe. September 11th, 1776, 1 year before, is the date of that peace conference on Staten Island. I think you do have that date right, Joe. Actually, that's not a question, that's just a comment. I just realized that looking at it again. Sorry about that, Joe. All right, that's all the questions I see, Mike, unless you see some in the chat.
Yeah, I have some others here in the chat. There's a question here. What do you think that Sullivan took away from all of this?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'll say this. He does continue to faithfully serve Washington. You could argue, Wow, that's a really good question. Trying to think of how I want to answer that. I would say it makes him more loyal to Washington. Because those of you that aren't familiar, later in the fall, there's a movement that Washington replaced as commander-in-chief called the Conway Cabal. And there are a number of senior officers that back that movement. Sullivan is going to be one of the loyalists and stick to Washington. So my initial thought on that question is it makes him closer to Washington because Washington defended him and doesn't blame him for the loss. And he does, I mean, he holds major commands the rest of the war. So that's my initial take without digging a little deeper into my notes and stuff. That's my initial answer to that question, whoever answered it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a great answer though. And that's, I think, one of those things that kind of shows, what kind of people sharing battlefields, what happens. Even though things go wrong, sometimes where things go wrong is where some of the greatest trust then is forged between people. So another question we have here, is there any active archaeology being pursued at the battlefield?
That's a good question. Now, I know there was up until 3 or 4 years ago, there was a graduate student at the University of Temple overseeing a number of dig sites all over the battlefield. I don't know if that's an ongoing effort at this point, because I haven't heard about that in a while. But up until a few years ago, that was an active project where they were doing test pits and some larger scale stuff where they were finding mostly musket parts, round balls that were dropped in battle, like musket balls. I don't know. I don't recall them finding anything more major than that. And it was pretty scattered. Unfortunately, the Brandywine battlefield was heavily farmed in the 19th century, arguably well into the early 20th century. And so a lot of the battlefield evidence was destroyed just through farming practices. I mean, I'll give you another example. The farm where Nathaniel Greene's division fought, I know the property owner. He grew up on. He's now, I want to, probably in his late 70s now, but he grew up there as a kid. And he told me a story that when he was a kid, him and his brother were responsible for this large kitchen garden they had next to the house, which would have been right where one of the British regiments would have lined up to fight Greene. And he said when he was a kid, they pulled out bucket loads of musket balls out of that garden when they were working on the garden, which absolutely confirms that that's where the British regiment fought, either dropping balls or being hit by balls. That's why so many balls were found in that garden. And that's just an example. That wasn't archaeology. That was just some farm kids finding them on their farm. And so I think that's why we haven't found more in more recent years, is because of all the farming that's taken place there over, well over 100 years.
No, that makes sense. And second part to this person, Robert asked, what was the most surprising finding in your research, in doing the research for the book?
The myths. I found just looking here at the questions in the Q&A. I was surprised, like, considering how few people have written about the battle. I was surprised how many myths, because off the top of my head, there's 5 or 6 major myths that I dispel in the book. So we talked about the Pulaski one. There's a myth out there. It's the first battle the American flags carried in the battle. No, it wasn't. What we now think of the American flag was initially a naval or garrison flag. The first place it probably flew was over Fort Mifflin later in the campaign. Not carried by a regiment in battle, probably until the War of 1812, maybe not even the Mexican-American War. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. There's a myth about a local named Squire Thomas Cheney, he being the one that warns Washington. No 18th century evidence for it. In fact, the family history in the Chester County Archives or Historical Society, the first paragraph says we know the story is not true, but it's a great story and we keep telling it anyway. I mean, it's just like little things like that. It's just, I found that most people that wrote about the battle didn't really dig and look for the source of the story and confirm the source of the story. Like I found that a lot with Brandywine. And then when I worked on Germantown, I didn't really find that. I found next to none working on Germantown, and Brandywine was full of them. I'm just giving you some examples. Yeah. So I got one here in the Q&A about the sycamore tree. As far as I know, it's still standing over by Gilpin. Do you know, Mike? Have you been
Last
over by the
time I
Gilpin
was
House?
there, it was still there. Still
As
there,
far
and
as I know,
standing,
it's
looking healthy.
yeah. As far as I know, it's still standing. At least last time I walked over by the Gilpin House, which I don't do all the time, it was still there.
Right. And for those of you who don't know, there's this absolutely massive sycamore tree that's next to the Gilpin House. It's one of the prettiest trees that you can see in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I guess the story had always been, you know, that it was there at the time of the battle. That I don't know, but it is a massive tree. I don't think so.
Well, they dated it. At one point, I don't have it in my notes, but there was a file in the park when I worked down there that Longwood sent an arborist out to try to date it somehow. I don't remember exactly all the details, but sycamores grow incredibly fast, thick and fast. It doesn't take in the grand scheme of things that long for a sycamore to get, it's not like an oak. So that sycamore was off the top of my head, again, I don't remember all the details. It was probably like a sapling in the early 19th century, post-battle. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I have another question here, Mike. Can you tell me what the 6th Virginia did during the battle?
Oh, I got to remember where they were first. I'm going to grab the book.
All right.
Give me a second. I got to remember what brigade they're in, then I can tell you.
Not a
They
problem.
fought. I mean, they absolutely fought. I just got to remember what brigade they're in. It's not a bad question. I don't want to tell you the wrong info. So they're in Whedon's brigade, Green's division. So they're part of that fight at the end. So that fight at the end where they make that U-shaped formation in the twilight, and they stop that British advance in that triangulation of fire, they're part of that. Because they're part of Green's division.
That's close to Dilworth and like modern 202 and kind of
Yeah, it's just south of Dilworth. Now, when I wrote the book, I was under the impression, without being able to walk that guy's land, that this took place down where, I apologize for anybody that's not super familiar, but Oakland Road comes south out of Dilworth and parallels 202 for a while. Eventually, Oakland ties into US 202. There's a traffic light there. It's not far from a car dealership, just south of Jimmy John's Hot Dogs. If you know Jimmy John's Hot Dogs on US 202. Again, I apologize if you're not familiar with the area, but this is probably a good mile south of Dilworth.
Okay.
And I thought when I wrote the book that action was basically along 202 and then around where that intersection is today. But then about a year ago, I finally got on that farmer's property and got to walk it with the British engineer maps. I now think that fight was north of that intersection and west of 202, or where 202 is today, almost entirely on those farm grounds that are still extant.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so my map that's in the book is a little off because I was never able to walk that farm when I wrote the book. Yeah.
Another question here, Mike. Person asked whether you had ancestors that served in the American Revolution.
My family was here. I've never found a direct ancestor that fought. My family was farming in South Jersey at least as far back as the 1750s, at least the Harris side of my family. But I've not yet found one that actually served. In fact, it took until like 5 years ago to find one that fought in the Civil War.
Okay.
So I'm still struggling with the Revolutionary ones.
All right. Another question here about Lafayette. It said that you really didn't mention about Lafayette at the battle. Is his participation a myth?
No, that's not. So Lafayette, I didn't really go into Lafayette with this particular talk because it has nothing to do with Sullivan. But that's a fair question because he's a famous guy. So he technically has no command at Brandywine. He's a 19-year-old kid that Congress made a major general. And Washington's very leery at this point in the war of giving all these foreign officers commands, mainly because several of his officers, Greene, Knox, actually Sullivan might have been one of them too, threatened to resign if these French officers got higher commands than them. And so Washington was being very careful and diplomatic about who he was giving these commands to. And Lafayette's one of them. So he's technically an unattached general hanging around with Washington at Brandywine. Now, when all those divisions got sent up north, my take on it is the kid begged Washington to go help. That's my take on it. And Washington was probably like, go do whatever you want. And Lafayette rides up. Now, what happens after that is pretty well documented. He's somewhere along the line of Conway's brigade on Birmingham Hill. And these guys are so inexperienced and lack training that he's literally riding behind the line, helping them mount their bayonets. But he's doing it from his horse. And in the process of doing that, he takes a British musket ball through his thigh. So he gets wounded up there. They get him off the horse into a wagon, and they get him to Chester that night. That night, they put him on a barge on the Delaware River. The barge takes him to Easton, so way upriver. From Easton, he's put back in a wagon to take him to Bethlehem, where he recovers from that wound. So he recovers from that wound and rejoins the Army mid-November. And this is where the story gets interesting if you were listening to me talking about Adam Stephen getting thrown out of the Army earlier. So by mid-November, there's all this chaos happening on the Delaware River around the river forts. And there's an action at a place called Gloucester. On November 25th or 26th, there's a Battle of Gloucester, where Lafayette takes Daniel Morgan's riflemen and some New Jersey militia and attacks a Hessian Jaeger outpost outside of Gloucester. And Lafayette looks like a hero. You know, he kills and captures a bunch of Hessians, and it's one of the few victories of the entire campaign for the Americans. And he looks great, recovered from his wound. And ironically, around the same time, Stephen is thrown out of the Army, and guess whose division Lafayette gets the command? Adam Stevens' division. I can't prove that that's all connected, but I think there's a connection between Stevens' ouster and Lafayette's elevation to division command. So
now on the battlefield today, there is a marker where Lafayette is wounded.
Mm-hmm. There's a marker for him being wounded. It's not in the right spot. So a little bit of background.
But it's been there for a long time. That's
it goes back to the 1890s.
Right.
So there is after the little bit of background on monument history. After the Civil War, the veterans of the Civil War formed these clubs, like the equivalent of today's VFWs. They were called GAR posts. GAR stood for Grand Army of the Republic, and they formed these posts all over the country. But they also raised money to erect monuments all over the place. We think of most of those monuments as being on Civil War battlefields, but they also raised money for other monuments. So the Westchester post of the GAR raised the money for the Lafayette Wounding Monument. Now, something a lot of people don't know about all these monuments, including the ones on the Civil War battlefields, is every time they erected a monument, they published a book about the history of that monument and the ceremony surrounding its creation or erection. There's a book for that Lafayette monument, which I have a copy of. And if you look in that book, it says, they know, all right, let me back up a little bit farther. Don't you find it odd when you're visiting a Gettysburg or a Shiloh or even an Antietam, all the monuments are along the roads. Do you really think all those regiments were on those roads that didn't even exist in the 18th century or the 19th century? Those are all modern park roads, a lot of them. They put those monuments where they could be seen by the visiting public. But if you read their dedication booklets, the booklets are very specific about where the regiment actually fought in relationship to the monument. Well, it's the same with the Lafayette Monument. They wanted that along the major road on a little knoll so everybody driving down that road could see it. But if you read the dedication book, it says Lafayette was wounded a half-mile west of here, which is over where it's now a township park, Birmingham Hill Park. The walking trails on Birmingham Hill is where he was actually wounded, not where the monument is. So I probably gave you way too long of an answer there, but that's the monument history.
But it's a neat thing because it's an early monument that's on that in that area. At least that's marking the battlefield. So that's everything that I have that came through, Mike. And certainly the other thing that I do want to mention is that you do conduct battlefield tours, private battlefield tours. So Mike's information, of course, is here in his last slide. So if you'd ever be interested in that, you can contact him. And the idea that you can actually go and see Brandywine, which largely looks the way that it did, at least 100 years ago, and a lot of places, even at the time of the battle, are still very reminiscent. That part of Chester County still looks a lot like the way that it would have, 200 plus years ago. So that to me was one of the great things about Mike's book, is that it put some of these actions physically on the landscape for me for the first time. So that was something that I enjoyed. So anyway, well, thank you everyone for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Mike Harris, our speaker, for his presentation, and for Kathy Donaldson for helping to organize our virtual talk. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program. And if you or your business would like to sponsor a future lecture, please contact the site for further information. And of course, donations are gladly accepted. So please join us for our next lecture on Tuesday, October 11th, when museum volunteer Tom Lehman will discuss the farms of Gettysburg. So just a reminder that the museum is now open Friday through Sunday. So please check our website for details and tour information. And please stay safe, everyone, and have a good night.